What if I told you that God's own chosen people would one day turn their swords against each other? That brothers who once stood together at Mount Sinai would spill each other's blood for centuries? This is the shocking true story of how one moment of pride tore apart the greatest kingdom on earth. From Solomon's golden throne to the ashes of Jerusalem. Witness how division, rebellion, and broken promises led to the most tragic civil war in biblical history. The 12 tribes that conquered giants would now face their greatest enemy, themselves. Prepare to discover the hidden prophecies, political intrigue, and divine judgments that split God's kingdom in two and changed the course of history forever. This is not just ancient history. It's a warning that echoes through the ages. The great kingdom that David built and Solomon expanded was starting to crack. What began as a golden age was slowly turning into something darker. Solomon needed money, lots of it, for his grand building projects. The magnificent temple, his luxurious palace, and cities across the land all required resources that the kingdom had never spent before. 1 Kings chapter 4 tells us about Solomon's system. He divided Israel into 12 districts, each responsible for providing food and supplies for the royal court for 1 month every year. But this was just the beginning. The king also demanded something that would create deep wounds in his people's hearts. As we read in 1 Kings chapter 5, verse 13, King Solomon conscripted laborers from all Israel, 30,000 men. These weren't volunteers. These were fathers, sons, and brothers forced to leave their families and work on the king's projects. The text continues. He sent them off to Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 a month, so that they spent 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Imagine being torn away from your farm, your family, your life, to cut down trees in a foreign land. The northern tribes felt this burden more heavily than anyone else. While Judah seemed to receive special treatment, the other tribes watched their men disappear into forced labor gangs month after month. But it didn't stop there. 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 21, reveals an even harsher reality. Their descendants remaining in the land, whom the Israelites could not exterminate. These Solomon conscripted for his slave labor force, as it is to this day. Solomon had created a system of permanent slavery within God's chosen people. The Bible tells us in 1 Kings chapter 5, verse 15, that Solomon also had 70,000 carriers and 80,000 stonecutters in the hills. Think about those numbers. That's 150,000 men working just on construction projects. Add the 30,000 cutting trees in Lebanon, and you have almost 200,000 men taken away from their normal lives. Every family in Israel felt this burden. Mothers watched their sons march away. Wives said goodbye to husbands who might not return for months. Children grew up barely knowing their fathers. The kingdom that was supposed to be blessed by God was becoming a place where families were torn apart for the king's glory. Solomon's troubles didn't begin with money or labor. They started in his heart. The king who once asked God for wisdom was now making choices that would destroy everything his father David had built spiritually. As 1 Kings chapter 11 opens, we see the root of the problem. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter: Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. These weren't just marriages. They were spiritual disasters waiting to happen. God had been clear about this. As verse 2 reminds us, they were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, "You must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods." Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. The Bible tells us in verse 3 just how far this went. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. 700 wives and 300 concubines. Each marriage was probably a political alliance, but each one also brought foreign gods into the heart of Israel. And that's exactly what happened. Verse 4 tells us the tragic truth. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David, his father, had been. Picture this scene. The man who built God's temple was now building altars to false gods. Verse 7 shows us just how far he fell. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites. Chemosh demanded child sacrifice. Molech required babies to be burned alive. These weren't just different religions. These were demons that demanded the blood of innocents. And Solomon, the wisest man on earth, was building places where his wives could worship these evil spirits. The same hands that had dedicated the temple to the Lord were now raising stones to honor demons. The kingdom that was supposed to be a light to the nations was now embracing the very darkness God had commanded them to drive out. Verse 8 tells us he didn't stop there. He did the same for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. The smell of burning sacrifices to false gods was rising from the hills around Jerusalem, mixing with the smoke from God's temple. It was a spiritual abomination that made God's anger burn hot. God's patience has limits, and Solomon had crossed them. The Lord, who had appeared to Solomon twice, who had blessed him beyond measure, now began to act in judgment. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 14 tells us what happened next. Then the Lord raised up against Solomon an adversary, Hadad the Edomite, from the royal line of Edom. This wasn't random political trouble. This was divine judgment in action. Hadad had a personal reason to hate Solomon. Years earlier, when David conquered Edom, his commander Joab had tried to kill every male in the country. But Hadad was just a boy then, and some Edomite officials had rescued him and fled to Egypt. The Bible tells us in verses 17 to 18 what happened. But Hadad, still only a boy, fled to Egypt with some Edomite officials who had served his father. They set out from Midian and went to Paran. Then, taking people from Paran with them, they went to Egypt, to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who gave Hadad a house and land and provided him with food. Now Hadad was grown, married to Pharaoh's sister-in-law, and had a son. But he never forgot what David's army had done to his people. When he heard that both David and Joab were dead, he asked Pharaoh to let him return home, as verse 22 records. Then Pharaoh said to him, "But what have you lacked here with me that you want to go back to your own country?" "Nothing," Hadad replied, "but do let me go." But God wasn't finished. Verse 23 introduces us to another enemy. And God raised up against Solomon another adversary, Rezon's son of Eliada, who had fled from his master, Hadadezer, king of Zobah. Rezon gathered men around him and became leader of a rebel band. When David defeated Hadadezer, Rezon escaped and eventually took control of Damascus. The Bible tells us in verse 25 that Rezon was Israel's adversary as long as Solomon lived, adding to the trouble caused by Hadad. So Rezon ruled in Aram and was hostile toward Israel. These weren't just political problems. They were signs that God's favor was lifting from Solomon's kingdom. The same God who had given Solomon peace on all sides was now allowing enemies to rise up and trouble him. The kingdom that once made other nations tremble was now being attacked from multiple directions. God rarely acts without warning, and he was about to send a message that would change everything. The messenger was a prophet named Ahijah from Shiloh, and his target was a young man named Jeroboam. Jeroboam wasn't just anybody. 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 28 tells us, "Now Jeroboam was a man of standing, and when Solomon saw how well the young man did his work, he put him in charge of the whole labor force of the tribes of Joseph." This was the man Solomon trusted to oversee the forced labor of Ephraim and Manasseh, two of the most powerful northern tribes. Jeroboam saw firsthand how the people suffered under Solomon's harsh policies. He watched families torn apart, saw men worked to exhaustion, witnessed the growing anger in the northern tribes. But God had different plans for Jeroboam, as verses 29 to 30 describe the scene. About that time Jeroboam was going out of Jerusalem, and Ahijah the prophet of Shiloh met him on the way, wearing a new cloak. The two of them were alone out in the country, and Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. Picture this moment. Two men alone on a dusty road, and suddenly the prophet grabs his new robe and rips it apart. This wasn't just dramatic. This was prophecy in action. In those days, when a prophet acted out a message, it meant God was about to make it happen. Then Ahijah spoke the words that would reshape history, as recorded in verse 31. "Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes." But God wasn't being unfair to David's family. Verses 32 to 33 explain why this was happening. "But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, he will have 1 tribe. I will do this because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Moloch, the god of the Ammonites, and have not walked in obedience to me, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my decrees and laws as David, Solomon's father, did." The message was clear and shocking. God himself was going to split his people's kingdom, and he was giving 10 tribes to this young labor supervisor. But it wouldn't happen immediately. God still honored his promise to David. When Solomon heard about Ahijah's prophecy, his reaction was swift and deadly. As 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 40 tells us, Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam fled to Egypt, to Shechem the king, and stayed there until Solomon's death. Think about what this meant. The man who had been wise enough to settle disputes between mothers, who had impressed the Queen of Sheba with his understanding, was now so threatened by a prophecy that he was willing to murder one of his own officials. But this also revealed something about Solomon's spiritual condition. A king who truly trusted God wouldn't be afraid of prophecy. He would seek to understand God's will and repent if necessary. Instead, Solomon's first instinct was violence. The wise king had become a paranoid tyrant. Jeroboam was smart, though. He knew that if God had chosen him, no human king could stop it. So he ran to the one place Solomon couldn't reach him, Egypt. There, under Pharaoh Shishak's protection, he waited. This wasn't just a political escape. This was faith in action. Jeroboam believed God's word enough to risk everything. He left his position of authority, his comfortable life in Jerusalem, his family and friends. He became an exile in a foreign land, trusting that the Lord who had spoken through Ahijah would make good on his promise. Egypt was an interesting choice of refuge. This was the same country that had enslaved Israel for 400 years. But now it became a place of safety for a future king of Israel. God works in mysterious ways, sometimes using even former enemies to accomplish his purposes. Years passed. Jeroboam lived as a refugee in Pharaoh's court, watching and waiting. He probably heard news from home, reports of Solomon's continued building projects, stories of the king's many wives, whispers about the growing resentment among the northern tribes. Every day that passed was another day closer to God's promise being fulfilled. Jeroboam had learned to be patient, to trust God's timing rather than trying to force things to happen. This was preparation for kingship, learning to wait on the Lord. After 40 long years on the throne, Solomon's time was up. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 42 records it simply. Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years. 40 years. That's how long it took for the wisest man in the world to destroy the spiritual foundation of his kingdom. The man who had started his reign by asking for wisdom to govern God's people was ending it with enemies on every border and division in every heart. When Solomon began his reign, the kingdom was united, wealthy, and blessed by God. Israel was respected and feared by every nation from Egypt to the Euphrates River. The temple was the most magnificent building in the world, and people came from everywhere just to see Solomon's wisdom and wealth. But now, at the end, everything was different. The people were angry and divided. Enemies were attacking from multiple directions. The spiritual life of the nation was corrupted by foreign gods and pagan worship. The forced labor system had created resentment that would never heal. Verse 43 tells us what happened next. Then he rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David his father. And Rehoboam, his son, succeeded him as king. Just like that, the golden age was over. The kingdom that had reached from Egypt to the Euphrates, that had made Israel the envy of every nation, was now in the hands of Solomon's son. But Rehoboam wasn't inheriting his father's wisdom. He was inheriting his father's problems. The forced labor gangs were still there. The heavy taxes were still crushing the people. The resentment that had been building for decades was about to explode. The new king also inherited a kingdom on the edge of civil war. For 40 years, the northern tribes had watched Judah receive preferential treatment while they carried the heaviest burdens. They had endured forced labor, excessive taxation, and spiritual corruption. Now they were ready to demand change. And somewhere in Egypt, a man named Jeroboam heard the news and knew his time had come. The prophecy that had driven him into exile was about to be fulfilled. When Solomon died, something interesting happened. Instead of automatically accepting Rehoboam as king in Jerusalem, all the tribes of Israel called for a meeting at Shechem. This wasn't the normal way to crown a new king, and the location they chose sent a powerful message. Shechem wasn't just any city. It was loaded with spiritual significance. This was where Abraham first built an altar when God promised him the land. It was where Jacob bought land and dug a well that would still be there when Jesus talked to the Samaritan woman centuries later. Most importantly, it was where Joshua gathered all the tribes to renew their covenant with God before he died. The people were saying something important by choosing Shechem. They were reminding everyone that Israel belonged to God first and kings second. They were going back to their roots, to the place where their ancestors had promised to serve the Lord. 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 1 tells us what happened. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had gone there to make him king. Notice something important here. The text doesn't say they went there to crown him. It says they went there to make him king. The difference is huge. They were letting Rehoboam know that becoming king wasn't automatic. He would have to earn their loyalty. This was already a sign that Solomon's kingdom was fracturing. In David's time, when he died, Solomon became king without question. The people loved David so much that they gladly accepted his son. But now, 40 years later, the tribes were demanding to have their say. Think about how this must have felt to Rehoboam. He had grown up as a prince in Jerusalem, surrounded by luxury and servants. He probably expected to simply take his father's throne and continue ruling the way Solomon had. But instead, He was being summoned to Shechem like a common citizen to justify his right to be king. The journey from Jerusalem to Shechem was only about 30 miles, but it must have felt much longer to the new king. With every step, he was moving away from the comfort and security of his father's palace and into uncertain territory. When Rehoboam arrived at Shechem, he found representatives from all 12 tribes waiting for him. These weren't just random people. These were the leaders, the elders, the men who spoke for their tribes, and they had serious business to discuss. When Rehoboam arrived at Shechem, he got a surprise. Jeroboam was there too. The man who had fled to Egypt years earlier had returned, and he was speaking for the northern tribes. 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 3 to 4 record what happened. So they sent for Jeroboam, and he and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam and said to him, "Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." This was their moment. After decades of forced labor, crushing taxes, and feeling ignored by Solomon's government, the people finally had a chance to speak up. And they weren't asking for much, just relief from the burden that had been breaking their backs for years. Notice how reasonable they were being. They weren't demanding revolution or rebellion. They weren't asking for independence or threatening violence. They were simply saying, "Make things easier for us, and we'll gladly serve you as king." It was a fair request from people who had suffered under Solomon's policies. The word yoke that they used was perfect. A yoke was the heavy wooden frame that farmers put on oxen to make them pull plows or carts. It was a symbol of hard work and burden. The people were saying that Solomon had treated them like work animals, and they wanted his son to treat them like human beings. But there was something else in their words. A warning. They were telling Rehoboam that their loyalty wasn't guaranteed. Unlike previous generations who had followed David and Solomon without question, these people were making their support conditional on how they were treated. Jeroboam's presence made the message even stronger. Here was the man God had chosen to rule 10 tribes, standing with the people and speaking their concerns. Even though the people might not have known about the prophecy, they could see that Jeroboam was a natural leader who understood their struggles. Rehoboam asked for 3 days to think about it. As verse 5 tells us, Rehoboam answered, "Go away for 3 days and then come back to me." So the people went away. 3 days. That's all the time the new king had to make the most important decision of his reign. Would he choose wisdom and compassion, following the example of his grandfather David? Or would he choose pride and harshness, following his father's later example? The future of God's kingdom hung in the balance. 12 tribes were watching and waiting. In Egypt, Pharaoh Shishak was probably hearing reports and planning his next move. Most importantly, God himself was watching to see if his prophecy would be fulfilled through human wisdom or human foolishness. The seeds of division that had been planted during Solomon's reign were about to either sprout into full rebellion or be pulled up by wise leadership. Everything depended on what Rehoboam would decide to do. The 3 days were up, and everyone gathered again at Shechem. Rehoboam had spent those days asking for advice, and now he had to give his answer. The future of the entire kingdom hung on what he would say next. First, Rehoboam had talked to the older men who had served his father Solomon. 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 7 tells us what they said. "If today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a good answer, they will always be your servants." These wise old men understood something important. Real leadership means serving the people, not just ruling over them. They had watched Solomon's kingdom grow angry and divided, and they knew the only way to heal it was through kindness and understanding. But Rehoboam also talked to his young friends, the men who had grown up with him in the palace. These young advisors had never known hardship or struggle. They had lived their whole lives surrounded by luxury and power. 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 10 to 11, record their terrible advice. The young men who had grown up with him replied, "These people have said to you, 'Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make our yoke lighter.' Now tell them, 'My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions.'" Think about how arrogant this advice was. Instead of showing mercy to suffering people, they wanted Rehoboam to boast about making things worse. Instead of healing the kingdom's wounds, they wanted him to tear them open even wider. When the people returned on the third day, Rehoboam made his choice. Verse 13 tells us what he did. The king answered the people harshly, rejecting the advice given him by the elders. Instead, verse 14 shows us the exact words he spoke. "My father made your yoke heavy. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." The crowd must have gasped when they heard these words. They had come asking for relief from their suffering, and the new king was promising to make their lives even worse. They had offered loyalty in exchange for kindness, and he had answered with threats and cruelty. But the Bible makes something clear in verse 15. "So the king did not listen to the people, for this turn of events was from the Lord, to fulfill the word the Lord had spoken to Jeroboam, son of Nebat, through Ahijah the Shilonite." Rehoboam thought he was showing strength, but he was actually fulfilling God's prophecy. His pride and harshness were the tools God used to split the kingdom exactly as he had promised. Sometimes human foolishness serves divine purposes. The reaction to Rehoboam's harsh words was immediate and explosive. The representatives of the northern tribes had heard enough. After decades of suffering under Solomon's policies, and now facing the promise of even worse treatment, they made a decision that would change history forever. 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 16 records their response. When all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king, "What share do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, Israel. Look after your own house, David." So the Israelites went home. These weren't just angry words. This was a formal declaration of independence. When they said, "What share do we have in David?" they were cutting all ties with the royal family that had ruled them for decades. When they said, "To your tents, Israel," they were using an ancient battle cry that meant, "Every man for himself." Think about how this must have felt to the tribal leaders. For 3 days they had waited patiently for a reasonable answer. They had offered loyalty and service in exchange for fair treatment. But instead of mercy, they got threats. Instead of a king who would serve them, they got a tyrant who wanted to crush them. The phrase, "Look after your own house, David," was particularly stinging. They were telling Rehoboam that he could be king of his own family if he wanted, but they were done being part of his kingdom. The unity that David had built through love and respect was being destroyed by his grandson's pride and cruelty. As the tribal representatives left Shechem and returned to their territories, they carried news that would spread like wildfire. The northern tribes were free from Rehoboam's rule. After 40 years of heavy taxation and forced labor under Solomon, and now facing even worse treatment under his son, they had chosen independence over oppression. But verse 17 shows us that not everyone joined the rebellion. But as for the Israelites who were living in the towns of Judah, Rehoboam still ruled over them. The tribe of Judah Rehoboam's own people remained loyal. They had benefited from the favoritism that Solomon had shown them, and they weren't ready to rebel against David's family. Benjamin, the small tribe that bordered Judah, also stayed loyal. These two tribes would form the southern kingdom, still ruled by David's descendants from Jerusalem. But the other 10 tribes, the vast majority of Israel's people and territory, were now free to choose their own king. The kingdom that God had given to David, that Solomon had expanded to its greatest glory, was now split in two. Brothers who had fought together against the Philistines and other enemies would now see each other as separate nations. With the northern tribes in rebellion, they needed a new king. They didn't have to look far. Jeroboam was right there among them, the man who had spoken for them at Shechem. More importantly, he was the man God had chosen through the prophet Ahijah's dramatic prophecy years earlier. 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 20 tells us what happened. When all the Israelites heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all Israel. Only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to the house of David. This wasn't a violent overthrow or military coup. This was the people choosing their leader freely and openly. The northern tribes gathered in assembly, probably at Shechem where everything had started, and formally crowned Jeroboam as their king. Think about how amazing this moment must have been for Jeroboam. Years earlier, he had been forced to flee to Egypt when Solomon tried to kill him. He had lived as an exile, trusting in God's promise that someday he would rule over 10 tribes. Now that promise was being fulfilled exactly as the prophet had said. But becoming king wasn't easy. Jeroboam inherited a kingdom that was angry, divided, and economically struggling. The northern tribes had just broken away from the wealthiest and most established part of Israel. They had no capital city, no established government, no treasury, and no army ready for war. The first thing Jeroboam did was establish his capital at Shechem. This made perfect sense. It was where the rebellion had started, where the tribes had gathered to make him king, and where their ancestors had renewed their covenant with God. Shechem was also centrally located in the territory of Ephraim, one of the most powerful northern tribes. The Bible tells us in verse 25 that Jeroboam fortified Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. A king needed a secure base of operations, and Shechem provided that. But Jeroboam also did something else that showed his strategic thinking. From there, he went out and built up Penuel. Penuel was located east of the Jordan River, in the territory that the tribes of Gad, Reuben, and half of Manasseh had settled. By fortifying Penuel, Jeroboam was showing that his kingdom included not just the tribes west of the Jordan, but also those on the eastern side. He was making sure all 10 tribes knew they were part of his new kingdom. But even as Jeroboam celebrated his rise to power, he faced a serious problem. The temple was still in Jerusalem, in Rehoboam's territory. Every faithful Israelite was supposed to go there for the major festivals. How could he keep his people loyal when their religion required them to visit his enemy's capital 3 times a year? Back in Jerusalem, Rehoboam was dealing with the shock of losing most of his kingdom. The young king who had expected to rule over all 12 tribes now controlled only 2. His harsh words at Shechem had cost him 80% of his territory and people. His first instinct was to solve the problem with force. 2 Chronicles chapter 11, verse 1 tells us what he did. When Rehoboam arrived in Jerusalem, he mustered Judah and Benjamin, 180,000 able young men, to go to war against Israel and to regain the kingdom for Rehoboam. 180,000 soldiers. That was an enormous army for those days. Rehoboam was planning a full-scale invasion to force the northern tribes back under his rule. He probably thought that if he could win a few quick battles, the rebels would submit and the kingdom would be reunited. But Rehoboam had forgotten something important. This division wasn't just about politics or economics. God himself had torn the kingdom apart through the prophecy given to Jeroboam. And God wasn't going to let human armies stop his plan. Just as Rehoboam was preparing for war, God sent a prophet named Shemaiah with a message. Verse 2 tells us what happened. But this word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God. The message was clear and direct, as recorded in verse 4. This is what the Lord says. Do not go up to fight against your fellow Israelites. Go home, every one of you, for this is my doing. Think about how hard this message must have been for Rehoboam to hear. He had just lost most of his kingdom, and now God was telling him he couldn't even try to get it back. The prophet was saying that the division was God's will, not just a political rebellion that could be fixed with military force. But the message wasn't just for Rehoboam, it was for all the soldiers too. Shemaiah called the northern tribes your fellow Israelites, reminding everyone that this wasn't a war against foreign enemies. These were brothers who would be fighting brothers, children of Abraham, killing children of Abraham. The Bible tells us in verse 4 what happened next. So they obeyed the word of the Lord and went home again, as the Lord had ordered. This was remarkable. A king ready for war, with a huge army assembled, simply sent everyone home because a prophet said so. This showed that even though the kingdom was divided politically, many people still recognized God's authority. They understood that no human king, not even David's grandson, had the right to fight against what God had clearly decreed. Rehoboam's army went home, and the northern tribes remained independent. The division that had started with harsh words at Shechem was now confirmed by divine command. There would be no quick military solution to reunite the kingdom. Even though Rehoboam's army had gone home, Jeroboam still faced a serious problem. The temple was in Jerusalem, in enemy territory. But God's law required all Israelite men to come there for 3 major festivals every year: Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 26 shows us Jeroboam's worry. Jeroboam thought to himself, the kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David. He could see the danger clearly. If his people kept going to Jerusalem to worship, they would be reminded of their old loyalty to David's family. They might decide to rejoin Rehoboam's kingdom. Verse 27 reveals his fear. If these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, they will again give their allegiance to their Lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam. So Jeroboam made a decision that would have terrible consequences for generations. Instead of trusting God to keep his promise, instead of finding a way to remain faithful while being politically independent, he chose to create his own religion. Verse 28 tells us what he did. After seeking advice, the king made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." Golden calves. The same type of idol that had gotten Israel in trouble at Mount Sinai when Moses was receiving the 10 Commandments. Jeroboam was repeating one of the worst mistakes in his people's history. But he tried to make it sound reasonable. He told the people it was too much for them to travel to Jerusalem. He was offering them convenience instead of faithfulness. He even claimed these golden calves were the gods who had rescued them from Egypt, trying to connect his idols to Israel's real history. Verse 29 shows us where he put these false gods. One he set up in Bethel, and the other in Dan. This was clever politically. Bethel was in the south of his kingdom, close to the border with Judah, while Dan was far in the north. People from all over the northern kingdom could worship at one of these sites without having to travel as far as Jerusalem. But it wasn't just about location, it was about control. Verse 31 tells us he went even further. Jeroboam built shrines on high places and appointed priests from all sorts of people, even though they were not Levites. God had commanded that only men from the tribe of Levi could serve as priests. But Jeroboam ignored this rule and appointed anyone he wanted. This meant he could control the religious system completely, making sure the priests would support his political goals instead of following God's laws. The kingdom that was supposed to worship the one true God now had two false gods, illegal priests, and worship centers that violated everything Moses had taught them. With both kingdoms now established, each needed a proper capital city. Jerusalem remained the seat of power for Rehoboam and the southern kingdom of Judah. This made sense. It was David's city, where the temple stood, and where Solomon had built his magnificent palace. But Jeroboam faced a different situation. He had started his reign in Shechem, which was historically important, but not really built to be a major capital. He needed something more impressive, more defensible, and more strategically located. 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 24 tells us about the solution that would eventually emerge. He bought the hill of Samaria from Shemer for 2 talents of silver and built a city on the hill, calling it Samaria, after Shemer, the name of the former owner of the hill. Actually, this happened during the reign of Omri, one of Jeroboam's successors, but it shows how the northern kingdom eventually solved their capital problem. Samaria would become the permanent seat of power for the kingdom of Israel, just as Jerusalem was for Judah. The choice of Samaria was brilliant militarily. It was built on a hill that was almost impossible to attack. The city commanded the main road through central Israel, allowing the kings of Israel to control trade and movement through their territory. From Samaria, the northern kings could watch both their own people and keep an eye on their enemies. But the establishment of 2 capitals meant something deeper than just politics. Now there were 2 centers of power where once there had been one, 2 royal courts where once there had been one, 2 governments making laws and collecting taxes from what used to be a single people. Jerusalem represented the old order, David's dynasty, Solomon's temple, the traditional way of doing things. The city was built on Mount Zion, which God had chosen as his dwelling place. It had the Ark of the Covenant, the priests descended from Aaron, and all the ceremonies that Moses had established. Samaria represented something new and different. It was a kingdom born out of rebellion, led by a man chosen by God, but not from David's family. It was a place where the old rules didn't necessarily apply, where new traditions could be started. The 2 capitals became symbols of the deeper division in Israel. Jerusalem looked to the past, to the promises God had made to David. Samaria looked to the future, to the possibility of doing things differently. Both claimed to be the true Israel, the real inheritors of God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Travelers moving between the 2 kingdoms would notice the differences immediately. The same people who had once been united under David and Solomon now had different kings, different laws, different customs, and unfortunately, different gods. The split between the kingdoms created a crisis that went far deeper than politics. It tore apart the religious life of God's people. This became especially clear when it came to the priests and Levites who served in the temple and taught God's law to the people. 2 Chronicles chapter 11, verses 13 to 14 tell us what happened. The priests and Levites from all their districts throughout Israel sided with him. The Levites even abandoned their pasture lands and property and came to Judah and Jerusalem, because Jeroboam and his sons had rejected them as priests of the Lord. Think about what this meant. These weren't just job changes. These were men giving up everything they owned to stay faithful to God. The Levites had been given specific cities and pasture lands throughout all the tribes of Israel. But when Jeroboam set up his golden calves and appointed non-Levitical priests, the real priests faced an impossible choice. They could stay in the northern kingdom and participate in false worship, or they could abandon their homes and move to Judah, where they could still serve God properly. For faithful men, there was really no choice at all. Verse 14 shows us the reason for their decision. Because Jeroboam and his sons had rejected them as priests of the Lord. Jeroboam didn't want priests who would put God's law above his political needs. He wanted religious leaders who would support his policies, even when those policies violated God's commands. But the priests and Levites weren't the only ones who moved south. Verse 16 tells us about others who made the same difficult choice. Those from every tribe of Israel who set their hearts on seeking the Lord, the God of Israel, followed the Levites to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices to the Lord, the God of their fathers. These were ordinary people from all 10 northern tribes who refused to worship Jeroboam's golden calves. They left their homes, their farms, their businesses, and moved to Judah so they could continue worshiping God the right way. This created a massive brain drain in the northern kingdom. The most educated, most spiritually minded, most faithful people were leaving. The priests who could teach God's law, the Levites who led worship, and the ordinary citizens who took their faith seriously were all moving south. For the southern kingdom, this was a huge blessing. Verse 17 shows the result. They strengthened the kingdom of Judah and supported Rehoboam, son of Solomon, 3 years, walking in the ways of David and Solomon during this time. All these faithful refugees made Judah stronger spiritually, economically, and militarily. They brought their skills, their wealth, their knowledge, and most importantly, their commitment to God's truth. But for the northern kingdom, this migration was a disaster. The people most likely to provide wise counsel, moral leadership, and spiritual guidance were gone. What remained was a kingdom increasingly cut off from its spiritual roots. As the dust settled on the divided kingdom, one thing became crystal clear. This wasn't just a political accident or a result of human failure. This division was part of God's plan, even though it was painful and seemed to contradict his promises. The prophet Ahijah had made this clear when he first spoke to Jeroboam years earlier. In 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 31 to 32, God had said through the prophet, "See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, he will have 1 tribe." God wasn't acting randomly or in anger. He was fulfilling justice while still keeping his promises. Solomon had turned away from God, embraced false religions, and oppressed his people. The kingdom needed to be judged for these sins. But God had also made an eternal promise to David that his family would always have a kingdom. So even in judgment, God preserved Judah and Benjamin for David's sake. The promise wasn't broken. It was being worked out in a way that served both justice and mercy. 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 15, makes this divine purpose absolutely clear. So the king did not listen to the people, for this turn of events was from the Lord, to fulfill the word the Lord had spoken to Jeroboam, son of Nebat, through Ahijah, the Shilonite. Even Rehoboam's foolish decision to be harsh with the people was part of God's plan. The young king thought he was showing strength, but he was actually being used by God to fulfill prophecy. Human pride and divine purpose came together to split the kingdom exactly as God had foretold. This didn't excuse Rehoboam's cruelty or Jeroboam's idolatry. Both men were responsible for their choices and would face consequences for their sins. But it did show that God can work even through human failure to accomplish His purposes. The division also served another purpose. It preserved a faithful remnant. When the northern kingdom fell into idolatry, the southern kingdom maintained the true worship of God, the proper priesthood, and the correct sacrificial system. The temple in Jerusalem continued to function as God had commanded, even though fewer people could come to worship there. Through all the political chaos, military threats, and religious confusion, God remained in control. The kingdom that looked like it was falling apart was actually being reshaped according to divine wisdom. The unity that seemed lost was being preserved in a different form, not as one political entity, but as two kingdoms that would each play their part in God's larger plan for His people. The promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob weren't canceled. They were being fulfilled in a new and unexpected way. The kingdom was divided, but God's purposes would continue to unfold through both Israel and Judah until the day when a greater king from David's line would reunite not just the tribes, but all the nations of the earth. Once the kingdom split, peace became a distant memory. The two new nations that had once been united under David and Solomon now faced each other as enemies. Brothers who had fought side by side against the Philistines were now preparing to fight each other. 1 Kings chapter 14 verse 30 tells us the sad reality. There was continual warfare between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. This wasn't just political tension or occasional disputes. This was constant, ongoing conflict that lasted throughout both their reigns. Think about what this meant for ordinary people. Farmers near the border never knew when soldiers might come through their fields. Merchants traveling between the kingdoms faced checkpoints, taxes, and the constant threat of being treated as enemy spies. Families that had relatives on both sides of the border found themselves torn apart by politics. The warfare wasn't just about major battles. It was about 1,000 smaller conflicts. Border towns changed hands repeatedly. Raiding parties from both sides would cross into enemy territory to steal cattle, burn crops, and capture prisoners. Each kingdom claimed territories that the other kingdom said belonged to them. 2 Chronicles chapter 12 verse 15 confirms this state of constant conflict. There was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam throughout their reigns. Neither king could establish secure control over disputed areas because the other was always ready to challenge any expansion. The saddest part was that both sides knew they were fighting their own brothers. These weren't foreign enemies with different languages and religions. These were the same people who had once celebrated the same festivals, worshipped at the same temple, and served under the same kings. But pride and political necessity kept the fighting going. Rehoboam couldn't accept that he had lost most of his father's kingdom. Jeroboam couldn't allow Rehoboam to reclaim any territory, knowing that success might encourage other tribes to return to David's family. Every small victory by one side was seen as a threat by the other. Every raid demanded revenge. Every captured town required a counterattack. The cycle of violence that started with harsh words at Shechem had become a way of life for both kingdoms. The constant warfare also prevented both kingdoms from reaching their full potential. Instead of building trade relationships with other nations, developing their agriculture, or strengthening their cities, both kings had to spend their resources on armies and fortifications. While Rehoboam and Jeroboam were busy fighting each other, a much bigger threat was watching from the south. Pharaoh Shishak of Egypt had been following the division of Israel with great interest. He remembered when Jeroboam had lived in his court as a refugee, and he saw an opportunity to expand Egyptian power. In Rehoboam's 5th year as king, Shishak decided to act. 2 Chronicles chapter 12, verse 2 tells us what happened. Because they had been unfaithful to the Lord, Shishak, king of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem in the 5th year of King Rehoboam. This wasn't a small raid. This was a massive invasion. Verse 3 describes the size of Shishak's army. With 1,200 chariots and 60,000 horsemen and the innumerable troops of Libyans, Sukkites and Cushites that came with him from Egypt. 1,200 chariots. In those days, chariots were like tanks, the most advanced military technology available. Egypt had always been famous for its chariots, and now they were rolling toward Jerusalem with the largest chariot force anyone in Israel had ever seen. But the invasion wasn't just about military power. It was divine judgment. The people of Judah had started following the same path as the northern kingdom, turning away from God and embracing foreign religions. Shishak's invasion was God's way of getting their attention. A prophet named Shemaiah came to Rehoboam and the leaders of Judah with a clear message. As recorded in verse 5, "Then the prophet Shemaiah came to Rehoboam and to the leaders of Judah who had assembled in Jerusalem for fear of Shishak. And he said to them, 'This is what the Lord says, you have abandoned me. Therefore I now abandon you to Shishak.'" The message hit home. Verse 6 tells us their response. The leaders of Israel and the king humbled themselves and said, "The Lord is just." They recognized that this invasion wasn't just bad luck. It was the consequence of their unfaithfulness to God. Because of their repentance, God showed mercy. But the damage was already done. Verse 9 describes what Shishak took from Jerusalem. When Shishak, king of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem, he carried off the treasures of the temple of the Lord and the treasures of the royal palace. He took everything, including the gold shield Solomon had made. All the wealth that Solomon had accumulated, the gold, the precious objects, the magnificent shields, was now in Egyptian hands. The temple that had been the most beautiful building in the world was stripped of its treasures. The kingdom that had once been the envy of all nations was now impoverished and humiliated. When Rehoboam died, his son Abijah became king of Judah. Unlike his father, who had eventually accepted the division of the kingdom, Abijah believed he had the right to rule over all 12 tribes. This led to the largest battle yet between the brother kingdoms. 2 Chronicles chapter 13 verse 3 describes the massive armies that faced each other. Abijah went into battle with an army of 400,000 able fighting men, and Jeroboam drew up a battle line against him with 800,000 able troops. 800,000 soldiers from Israel against 400,000 from Judah. This wasn't a border skirmish. This was total war. Nearly every able-bodied man in both kingdoms must have been involved in this conflict. The battle took place at Mount Zamarim, which was in the hill country of Ephraim. Before the fighting started, Abijah climbed up on the mountain and gave a speech that every soldier could hear. As recorded in verses 4 to 5, Abijah stood on Mount Zamarim in the hill country of Ephraim and said, "Jeroboam and all Israel, listen to me. Don't you know that the Lord, the God of Israel, has given the kingship of Israel to David and his descendants forever by a covenant of salt?" Abijah was claiming divine authority over the northern kingdom. He reminded them that God had made an eternal promise to David's family, and that Jeroboam was just a rebel who had no right to rule over God's people. But he didn't stop there. Verses 8 to 9 record his challenge. and now you plan to resist the kingdom of the Lord, which is in the hands of David's descendants. You are indeed a vast army, and have with you the golden calves that Jeroboam made to be your gods. But didn't you drive out the priests of the Lord, the sons of Aaron and the Levites, and make priests of your own, as the peoples of other lands do? This was spiritual warfare as much as physical warfare. Abijah was saying that Israel wasn't just fighting against Judah, they were fighting against God himself. He pointed out their false gods and their illegal priests as proof that they had abandoned the true faith. The battle itself was a disaster for Israel, despite their numerical advantage. Verse 17 tells us the outcome. Abijah and his army inflicted heavy losses on them, so that there were 500,000 casualties among Israel's able men. 500,000 dead. This was one of the bloodiest battles in the entire Bible. The northern kingdom lost more than half its army in a single day. Families throughout Israel received news that their fathers, sons, and brothers would never come home. Verse 18 explains why Judah won. The Israelites were subdued on that occasion, and the people of Judah were victorious because they relied on the Lord, the God of their ancestors. After Abijah's great victory, his son Asa became king of Judah. But Asa learned an important lesson from his father's war with Israel. Military strength was essential for survival. The northern kingdom was still there, still angry, and still dangerous. 2 Chronicles chapter 14 verse 8 tells us about Asa's army. Asa had an army of 300,000 men from Judah, equipped with large shields and with spears, and 280,000 from Benjamin, armed with small shields and with bows. All these were brave, fighting men. 580,000 soldiers. Asa had built one of the largest armies in Judah's history. He understood that the days when the 12 tribes could live together in peace were over. Now each kingdom needed to be ready for war at any moment. But Asa didn't just build an army, he also fortified his cities. Verses 6 to 7 describe his building projects. He built up the fortified cities of Judah, since the land was at peace and no one was at war with him. During those years, for the Lord gave him rest. Let us build up these towns, he said to Judah, and put walls around them, with towers, gates, and bars. The land is still ours, because we have sought the Lord our God. We sought him, and he has given us rest on every side. So they built and prospered. Think about what this meant. A king of God's people was spending huge amounts of money and labor, building walls and fortifications to protect his cities from his own brothers. The unity that David had created was now completely gone, replaced by the constant threat of war. Asa also recognized that military strength alone wasn't enough. Verse 4 tells us about his spiritual reforms. He commanded Judah to seek the Lord, the God of their ancestors, and to obey his laws and commands. The king understood that God's blessing was more important than military power. But he also understood that God expected his people to be prepared and not just rely on miracles. When the massive Ethiopian army of Zerah invaded Judah with 1,000,000 soldiers and 300 chariots, Asa's preparations paid off. 2 Chronicles chapter 14 verse 11 records his prayer before the battle. Then Asa called to the Lord his God and said, "Lord, there is no one like you to help the powerless against the mighty. Help us, Lord our God, for we rely on you, and in your name we have come against this vast army. Lord, you are our God. Do not let mere mortals prevail against you." God gave Asa victory over the Ethiopians. But the lesson was clear. The kingdoms of Israel and Judah now lived in a world where military strength was essential for survival. After Jeroboam died, his son Nadab became king of Israel. But Nadab's reign was short. He was assassinated by one of his commanders named Baasha, who then took the throne. Baasha proved to be even more aggressive toward Judah than Jeroboam had been. 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 17 tells us about Baasha's strategy. Baasha, king of Israel, went up against Judah and fortified Rama to prevent anyone from leaving or entering the territory of Asa, king of Judah. This was economic warfare. Rama was only about 5 miles north of Jerusalem, right on the main road between the two kingdoms. By fortifying Rama, Baasha was essentially putting Jerusalem under siege without actually attacking the city. Think about how dangerous this was for Judah. Merchants couldn't travel north to trade. People couldn't visit relatives in the northern kingdom. Most importantly, the faithful Israelites who wanted to come to Jerusalem for the festivals were being blocked by Baasha's fortress. Asa realized he was in serious trouble. He couldn't attack Rama directly because it was too well fortified, and he couldn't ignore it because it was slowly strangling his kingdom. So he made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. 1 Kings chapter 15, verses 18 to 19, tell us what Asa did. Asa then took all the silver and gold that was left in the treasures of the Lord's temple and of his own palace. He entrusted it to his officials and sent them to Ben-Hadad, son of Tabrimon, the son of Hetzion, the king of Aram, who was ruling in Damascus. "Let there be a treaty between me and you," he said, "as there was between my father and your father. See, I am sending you a gift of silver and gold. Now break your treaty with Baasha, king of Israel, so he will withdraw from me." This was a brilliant but dangerous strategy. Ben-Hadad of Syria was already Baasha's ally, but Asa was offering him a better deal. If Syria attacked Israel from the north, Baasha would have to withdraw from Rama to defend his own territory. The plan worked perfectly. Verse 20 describes what happened. Ben-Hadad agreed with King Asa and sent the commanders of his forces against the towns of Israel. He conquered Ijon, Dan, Abel-Beth-Makkah, and all Kinnereth, in addition to Naphtali. When Baasha heard that his northern cities were being attacked, he had no choice. Verse 21 tells us, when Baasha heard this, he stopped building Rama and withdrew to Tirzah. The siege was broken, and Judah was safe. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Asa had emptied both the temple treasury and the royal treasury to pay for Syrian help. Even worse, he had established a precedent that would haunt both kingdoms for generations. After Baasha died, the northern kingdom went through a period of chaos and civil war. But eventually, a military commander named Omri seized power and established the most powerful dynasty Israel had ever known. 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 24 tells us about Omri's most important achievement. He bought the hill of Samaria from Shemer for 2 talents of silver and built a city on the hill, calling it Samaria, after Shemer, the name of the former owner of the hill. Samaria wasn't just another city. It was a masterpiece of military engineering. Built on a hill that rose 300 feet above the surrounding valley, it was almost impossible to capture. The city had strong walls, plenty of water, and commanded all the major roads through central Israel. But Omri's most significant achievement was his son Ahab, who became one of the most powerful kings Israel ever had. 1 Kings chapter 16 verse 30 tells us about Ahab's character. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. Ahab married Jezebel, a princess from Sidon, and she brought her Baal worship into Israel. This wasn't just about adding another false god to Jeroboam's golden calves. This was about replacing God entirely with a foreign religion. Under Ahab, the northern kingdom became stronger militarily and economically than it had ever been before. The magnificent capital of Samaria rivaled Jerusalem in beauty and exceeded it in defensive strength. Israel had allies with powerful nations like Sidon and was becoming a major regional power. This created a new dynamic between the kingdoms. For the first time since the split, Israel was clearly stronger than Judah. The northern kingdom no longer looked like a collection of rebellious tribes. It looked like a legitimate nation that could stand on its own. But the religious situation was getting worse, not better. While Judah maintained the temple worship and the legitimate priesthood, Israel was embracing paganism more completely than ever before. The division wasn't just political anymore. It was becoming a conflict between true religion and false religion. 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 33 summarizes Ahab's spiritual impact. Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel. Then did all the kings of Israel before him. The northern kingdom was becoming stronger in every way, except the most important one. Its relationship with God was deteriorating rapidly. When Asa died, his son Jehoshaphat became king of Judah. Unlike his father, who had viewed Israel as an enemy, Jehoshaphat believed that the two kingdoms should work together against their common enemies. This seemed like wisdom, but it led to serious problems. 2 Chronicles chapter 18 verse 1 tells us about Jehoshaphat's strategy. Now Jehoshaphat had great wealth and honor, and he allied himself with Ahab by marriage. A marriage alliance. Jehoshaphat arranged for his son Jehoram to marry Athaliah, who was either Ahab's daughter or sister. This was supposed to create peace between the kingdoms and unite them against external threats. The alliance led to a joint military campaign against Syria. Verses 28 to 29 describe how the two kings went into battle together. So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, went up to Ramoth-Gilead. The king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, "I will enter the battle in disguise, but you wear your royal robes." So the king of Israel disguised himself and went into battle. This battle was a disaster. Ahab was killed, and the alliance fell apart. But the marriage connection remained, and it would bring terrible consequences to Judah in the next generation. Later, Jehoshaphat tried another alliance with Ahab's son, Ahaziah. 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 35 tells us. Later, Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, made an alliance with Ahaziah, king of Israel, whose ways were wicked. This time they planned to build ships together and trade with distant lands. But verse 37 shows us what happened. Then Eleazar, son of Dodavahu of Mareshah, prophesied against Jehoshaphat, saying, "Because you have made an alliance with Ahaziah, the Lord will destroy what you have made." The ships were wrecked and were not able to set sail for trading. God clearly disapproved of these alliances. Even though Jehoshaphat was a righteous king who genuinely wanted to serve God, his attempts to cooperate with the wicked kings of Israel brought divine judgment. The problem wasn't political, it was spiritual. The northern kingdom had completely abandoned true worship of God, and any alliance with them meant compromising with false religion. God wanted the two kingdoms to remain separate until they could be reunited under a righteous king. The Omri dynasty came to a violent end when God sent a prophet to anoint a military commander named Jehu as the new king of Israel. Jehu's revolution was swift, brutal, and complete. 2 Kings chapter 9, verse 24 describes how Jehu killed King Joram of Israel. Then Jehu drew his bow and shot Joram between the shoulders. The arrow pierced his heart, and he slumped down in his chariot. But Jehu didn't stop there. He also killed Ahaziah, the king of Judah, who happened to be visiting Israel at the time. Then he killed Jezebel, throwing her from a window. After that, he murdered all 70 sons of Ahab's family, eliminating any possible rivals to his throne. 2 Kings chapter 10 verse 11 tells us about the scope of Jehu's purge. So Jehu killed everyone in Jezreel who remained of the house of Ahab, as well as all his chief men, his close friends, and his priests, leaving him no survivor. This wasn't just a change of government. This was the complete destruction of everything connected to the previous dynasty. Anyone who had served Ahab, supported him, or was related to him was killed. Jehu also targeted the religious system that Ahab and Jezebel had established. 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 28 records his actions against Baal worship. So Jehu destroyed Baal worship in Israel. He gathered all the prophets and priests of Baal into their temple, pretending to worship with them, then had them all killed and destroyed the temple completely. This revolution sent shockwaves through both kingdoms. In Judah, Athaliah, who was Ahab's daughter and had married into the royal family, seized power when her son Ahaziah was killed. She tried to murder all the royal family and rule as queen. The violence that had started with Jehu's revolution in Israel had now spread to Judah. For 6 years, David's dynasty was almost extinct, saved only by a baby prince named Joash, who was hidden in the temple. The revolution showed how completely the two kingdoms had become enemies. Political changes in one kingdom immediately affected the other, usually through violence and bloodshed. The unity that had once existed under David and Solomon was now just a memory. Both kingdoms were learning that division brought not just political problems, but also instability, violence, and the constant threat of civil war. The brother nations that should have been supporting each other were instead destroying each other, one generation at a time, far to the northeast, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. A new empire was rising that would change everything. The Assyrians had been a regional power for centuries, but now they were becoming the most feared military force the world had ever seen. 2 Kings chapter 15 verse 19 gives us our first glimpse of this threat. Then Pul, king of Assyria, invaded the land, and Menahem gave him 1,000 talents of silver to gain his support, strengthen his own hold on the kingdom. Pul was also known as Tiglath-Pileser III, and he was the king who turned Assyria into a world-conquering empire. When he invaded Israel, King Menahem didn't even try to fight. He immediately paid tribute. 1,000 talents of silver was an enormous amount of money, enough to bankrupt most kingdoms. But paying tribute didn't buy safety. It just made Assyria stronger and marked Israel as a weak nation that could be easily conquered. Verse 20 tells us how Menahem raised this massive payment. Menahem exacted this money from Israel. Every wealthy person had to contribute 50 shekels of silver to be given to the king of Assyria. So the king of Assyria withdrew and stayed in the land no longer. Think about what this meant. The wealthy people of Israel were being forced to pay protection money to a foreign empire. The northern kingdom that had once been proud and independent was now a puppet state, surviving only because it could buy its way out of trouble. The Assyrian threat created a strange situation for both Israel and Judah. For the first time since the kingdom divided, they faced an enemy that was bigger and more dangerous than either of them alone. This should have brought them together, but decades of hatred and mistrust made cooperation almost impossible. 2 Kings chapter 16 verse 7 shows us how this played out. Ahaz sent messengers to say to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, "I am your servant and vassal. Come up and save me out of the hand of the king of Aram and of the king of Israel, who are attacking me." This was King Ahaz of Judah, begging the Assyrians to protect him from his own brothers in Israel. Instead of the two kingdoms uniting against their common enemy, they were asking that enemy to help them fight each other. The Assyrians were clever enough to use this division to their advantage. They would make alliances with one kingdom against the other, then betray both when it suited their purposes. What should have been Israel and Judah's greatest strength, their shared heritage and faith, had become their greatest weakness. The prophet Isaiah watched these events and understood what was really happening. In Isaiah chapter 7 verse 9, he warned, "If you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all." The divided kingdoms were learning that political maneuvering couldn't replace trust in God. While the Assyrian threat was growing stronger, the northern kingdom was growing weaker spiritually. The golden calves that Jeroboam had set up at Dan and Bethel were just the beginning. Now, Israel was embracing every false religion they could find. 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 9 to 10. Describe how bad things had become. The Israelites secretly did things against the Lord their God that were not right. From watchtower to fortified city, they built themselves high places in all their towns. They set up sacred stones and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. Every hill had become a place of idol worship. Every town had its own collection of false gods. The people who were supposed to worship only the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were now bowing down to pieces of wood and stone. But it wasn't just about wrong worship. It was about wrong living. Verse 17 tells us about even more terrible practices. They sacrificed their sons and daughters in the fire. They practiced divination and sought omens and sold themselves to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, arousing his anger. Child sacrifice. The Israelites were burning their own children alive to please false gods like Moloch. Parents who should have been protecting their sons and daughters were instead offering them as human sacrifices. This was the ultimate rejection of everything God had taught them. The prophets kept warning them to stop, but nobody listened. Verse 13 shows us how patient God had been. The Lord warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and seers. Turn from your evil ways. Observe my commands and decrees in accordance with the entire law that I commanded your ancestors to obey and that I delivered to you through my servants, the prophets. God had sent prophet after prophet to call his people back to the right path. Men like Elijah and Elisha had performed amazing miracles to prove that the Lord was the true God. But the kings and people of Israel refused to listen. Verse 14 explains their stubborn response. But they would not listen and were as stiff-necked as their ancestors, who did not trust in the Lord, their God. The northern kingdom had reached the point where they didn't want to hear from God anymore. They preferred their false gods because those gods didn't demand righteousness or justice. They could worship Baal and keep living however they wanted, but the God of Israel demanded that they change their ways. King after king led the people deeper into spiritual darkness. They made alliances with pagan nations and adopted their religions. They oppressed the poor and ignored God's laws about justice and mercy. They turned the northern kingdom into everything God had warned them not to become. Even as Israel spiraled toward destruction, God didn't give up on his people. He sent some of the greatest prophets in history to warn both kingdoms about what was coming if they didn't repent. Hosea was one of these prophets, and God gave him a very personal way to understand Israel's unfaithfulness. Hosea chapter 1 verse 2 records God's strange command. When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, "Go, marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her. For like an adulterous wife, This land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord. God told Hosea to marry a woman who would be unfaithful to him, so he could understand how God felt when Israel worshipped other gods. Through his own heartbreak, Hosea learned to speak with the voice of a betrayed husband, calling his wife to come home. In Hosea chapter 11, verses 1 through 2, God spoke through the prophet with deep emotion. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. But the more they were called, the more they went away from me. They sacrificed to the Baals, and they burned incense to images. This wasn't the voice of an angry judge. This was the voice of a heartbroken father watching his children destroy themselves. God remembered how he had rescued Israel from slavery in Egypt, how he had cared for them in the wilderness, how he had given them the promised land. And now they were throwing it all away for false gods. Another prophet, Amos, focused on the social injustice that was destroying Israel from within. Amos chapter 5, verse 12, lists their crimes. For I know how many are your offenses and how great your sins. There are those who oppress the innocent and take bribes and deprive the poor of justice in the courts. The rich were getting richer by cheating the poor. Judges were taking bribes to rule against honest people. The powerful were using their positions to steal from those who couldn't defend themselves. This wasn't just economic inequality. This was systematic oppression of the weak by the strong. Amos warned them about the consequences in chapter 5, verse 27. Therefore, I will send you into exile beyond Damascus, says the Lord, whose name is God Almighty. Meanwhile, in the southern kingdom, prophets like Isaiah and Micah were giving similar warnings to Judah. Isaiah chapter 1, verse 4 described their spiritual condition. Woe to the sinful nation, a people whose guilt is great, a brood of evildoers, children given to corruption. They have forsaken the Lord. They have spurned the Holy One of Israel and turned their backs on him. Isaiah saw that Judah was following the same path as Israel. They might still have the temple and the proper priests, but their hearts were far from God. They were going through the motions of religion while living like pagans. Micah gave one of the clearest warnings about what God really wanted from his people. Micah chapter 6, verse 8 cuts through all the religious confusion. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. Justice, mercy, and humility. These were the things God cared about most. But both kingdoms were practicing injustice, cruelty, and pride. They had temples and sacrifices and religious festivals, but they had forgotten the heart of what it meant to serve God. The warnings had been ignored for too long. In 722 BC, the Assyrian army under King Shalmaneser V surrounded Samaria, the magnificent capital that Omri had built on its seemingly impregnable hill. 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 5 tells us about the siege. The king of Assyria invaded the entire land, marched against Samaria, and laid siege to it for 3 years. 3 years. For 3 long years, the people of Samaria held out behind their strong walls. They probably thought their city was too well fortified to fall. The hill was steep, the walls were thick, and they had plenty of water from wells inside the city. But the Assyrians were patient and determined. They built siege works around the entire city, cutting off all supplies. Slowly, the people inside began to starve. Food became scarce, then precious, then almost impossible to find. During those 3 terrible years, people must have remembered the prophet's warnings. Maybe they thought about Elijah and Elisha, who had performed miracles in this very kingdom. Maybe they wondered if it was too late to call out to the God their ancestors had abandoned. But the siege continued, and in the 3rd year, the walls were finally breached. Verse 6 records the end of the northern kingdom. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Assyria. He settled them in Hala, in Gozan on the Habor River, and in the towns of the Medes. The fall of Samaria wasn't just a military defeat. It was the end of a nation. The Assyrians didn't just conquer Israel. They destroyed it completely. They took the surviving population and scattered them across their vast empire, from the mountains of Media to the banks of the Euphrates River. This was the Assyrian way of preventing rebellions. Instead of leaving conquered peoples in their homeland where they might organize and fight back, they moved everyone to distant provinces where they would be surrounded by strangers and forced to start new lives. The Bible tells us exactly why this happened in verses 7 through 8. All this took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of Egypt from under the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They worshipped other gods and followed the practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before them, as well as the practices that the kings of Israel had introduced. This wasn't a random disaster or political accident. This was divine judgment on 2 centuries of rebellion against God. The northern kingdom had been given every opportunity to repent, but they had chosen idolatry and injustice instead. The 10 tribes that had followed Jeroboam when the kingdom split were now scattered across the Assyrian Empire. Most of them would never return to the promised land. They would marry into the populations where they were settled and gradually lose their identity as Israelites. The northern kingdom of Israel, which had lasted for about 200 years since the split under Rehoboam, was gone forever. Only Judah remained as a remnant of the great kingdom that David and Solomon had built. When news reached Jerusalem that Samaria had fallen and the northern kingdom was destroyed, the people of Judah must have been terrified. If the mighty Assyrian army could conquer Israel, what chance did the smaller southern kingdom have? But Judah had something Israel had lost. They still worshiped the true God at the temple in Jerusalem. They still had the priesthood that God had established through Aaron. They still followed most of the laws that Moses had given them. And God was not ready to destroy the city he had chosen or abandon the promises he had made to David. King Hezekiah was ruling Judah when Israel fell, and he was one of the most righteous kings in the entire Bible. 2 Kings chapter 18 verse 5 tells us about his faith. Hezekiah trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel. There was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, either before him or after him. When the Assyrian army came south to attack Jerusalem, Hezekiah didn't panic or try to make political alliances. Instead, he went to the temple and prayed. 2 Kings chapter 19 verse 15 records his prayer. And Hezekiah prayed to the Lord, "Lord, the God of Israel, enthroned between the cherubim, you alone are God over all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth." God answered Hezekiah's prayer in a miraculous way. In one night, an angel of the Lord killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers, and the surviving army retreated without capturing Jerusalem. The southern kingdom was saved because their king trusted in God instead of human schemes. But Judah's survival was only temporary. After Hezekiah died, his son Manasseh became king and led the people back into idolatry. 2 Kings chapter 21 verse 6 describes how evil Manasseh became. He sacrificed his own son in the fire, practiced divination, sought omens, and consulted mediums and spiritists. He did much evil in the eyes of the Lord, arousing his anger. For 55 years, Manasseh ruled Judah and undid all the good that his father Hezekiah had done. He filled Jerusalem with idols, murdered innocent people, and even put pagan altars inside God's temple. Later, King Josiah tried to reform the kingdom and bring the people back to God. 2 Kings chapter 23, verse 25 tells us about his efforts. Neither before nor after Josiah was there a king like him who turned to the Lord as he did, with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his strength, in accordance with all the law of Moses. Josiah tore down the idols, destroyed the pagan altars, and even found a copy of God's law that had been lost in the temple. For a while, it looked like Judah might be saved from the same fate that had destroyed Israel. But it was too late. The people went through the motions of reform, but their hearts hadn't really changed. As soon as Josiah died, they went back to their old ways of idolatry and injustice. God spoke through the prophet Jeremiah to explain why judgment was still coming. Jeremiah chapter 15, verse 4 records God's decision. I will make them abhorrent to all the kingdoms of the earth because of what Manasseh son of Hezekiah, king of Judah, did in Jerusalem. The sins of Manasseh's long reign had poisoned the southern kingdom so deeply that even Josiah's reforms couldn't heal the damage. Judah had survived Israel's fall by 135 years, but their time was running out. A new empire was rising in the east. Babylon had overthrown the Assyrians and was now the dominant power in the world. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon was even more ambitious than the Assyrian kings had been. He wanted to control everything from India to Egypt. 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 1 tells us how Judah first encountered this threat. During Jehoiakim's reign, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, invaded the land, and Jehoiakim became his vassal for 3 years. But then he rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. At first, King Jehoiakim of Judah tried the same strategy that had worked with Assyria. He paid tribute and hoped to be left alone. But unlike his ancestor Hezekiah, Jehoiakim didn't trust in God. He trusted in political alliances with Egypt and other nations. When Jehoiakim rebelled against Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar responded swiftly. Verse 10 describes what happened. At that time, the officers of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, advanced on Jerusalem and laid siege to it. The first siege of Jerusalem lasted only a few months. Jehoiakim died during the siege, and his young son Jehoiachin surrendered the city to avoid total destruction. Verse 14 tells us what Nebuchadnezzar took from Jerusalem. He carried all Jerusalem into exile, all the officers and fighting men, and all the skilled workers and artisans, a total of 10,000. Only the poorest people of the land were left. 10,000 people, the entire leadership class of Judah, were marched off to Babylon as prisoners. This included the young king Jehoiachin, the royal family, the army officers, the craftsmen who knew how to make weapons and tools, and anyone else who might be able to organize a rebellion. Nebuchadnezzar put Jehoiachin's uncle Zedekiah on the throne as a puppet king. But Zedekiah was weak and foolish. Despite seeing what had happened to his nephew, he also tried to rebel against Babylon. The final siege of Jerusalem began in 588 BC and lasted 2.5 years. 2 Kings chapter 25, verse 3, describes the terrible conditions inside the city. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine in the city had become so severe that there was no food for the people to eat. People were starving to death inside the walls of Jerusalem. Mothers watched their children waste away from hunger. The city that had once been the pride of the world was now filled with death and despair. When the walls were finally breached in 586 BC, the Babylonians showed no mercy. Verse 9 tells us what they did. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem, Every important building he burned down. The temple that Solomon had built, where God's presence had dwelt for over 400 years, was destroyed. The beautiful cedar beams that had come from Lebanon went up in flames. The gold and bronze furnishings were stripped away and carried off to Babylon. Verse 21 records the final end of the kingdom of Judah. So Judah went into captivity, away from her land. The division that had started with Rehoboam's harsh words at Shechem was now complete. Both kingdoms were gone, their people scattered among foreign nations, their land empty and desolate. The Babylonian exile wasn't just a political disaster. It was God's final judgment on both kingdoms for their centuries of unfaithfulness. The division that had begun with pride and rebellion had led to exactly what the prophets had warned would happen. Jeremiah chapter 25, verse 11, had predicted exactly how long the exile would last. This whole country will become a desolate wasteland, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. 70 years. That was long enough for an entire generation to be born and grow up in a foreign land. It was long enough for the survivors to forget what life in the promised land had been like. It was long enough for God's people to truly understand what they had lost through their rebellion. The prophet Ezekiel, who was among the exiles in Babylon, explained why this judgment was necessary. Ezekiel chapter 36, verses 17 to 19, record God's explanation. Son of man, when the people of Israel were living in their own land, they defiled it by their conduct and their actions. Their conduct was like a woman's monthly uncleanness in my sight. So I poured out my wrath on them because they had shed blood in the land and because they had defiled it with their idols. I dispersed them among the nations, and they were scattered through the countries. I judged them according to their conduct and their actions. This was strong language, but it showed how serious Israel's sins had become. They had polluted the land that God had given them. They had murdered innocent people. They had filled the promised land with idols and false worship. The exile also showed the consequences of the original division. If the 12 tribes had stayed united under David's dynasty, they would have been strong enough to resist foreign empires. If they had remained faithful to God's laws, He would have protected them from their enemies. But instead, they had spent 2 centuries fighting each other, weakening themselves, and turning away from God. The Assyrians and Babylonians had been able to conquer them precisely because they were divided and spiritually corrupted. 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 16 summarizes the tragic process that led to exile. But they mocked God's messengers, despised His words, and scoffed at His prophets until the wrath of the Lord was aroused against His people, and there was no remedy. God had sent prophet after prophet to warn them. He had performed miracles to get their attention. He had allowed their enemies to pressure them so they would turn back to Him. But instead of repenting, they had mocked the prophets and ignored the warnings. Now they were learning the hard way that God's words always come true. The blessings He promised for obedience had been replaced by the curses He warned would come from rebellion. But even in exile, God's people were still His people. The covenant He had made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob couldn't be broken by human unfaithfulness. The promises He had made to David about an eternal kingdom were still in effect, even though David's kingdom seemed to have ended forever. Even in the darkest moments of judgment and exile, God didn't abandon His people completely. Through the same prophets who had warned of coming destruction, He also promised future restoration and healing. Jeremiah, who had watched Jerusalem burn and seen his people marched off to Babylon, received one of the most beautiful promises of hope in the entire Bible. Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 31, records God's words. "The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah." A new covenant. This wasn't just a promise to bring the exiles back to their land. This was a promise to heal the spiritual problems that had caused the division in the first place. Verses 33 to 34 explain what this new covenant would be like. "This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, 'Know the Lord,' because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more." Think about what this meant. Instead of having God's law written on stone tablets that could be ignored or forgotten, it would be written on their hearts. Instead of having to learn about God from priests and prophets, everyone would know him personally. Instead of carrying the guilt of their rebellion forever, they would be completely forgiven. The prophet Ezekiel received an even more specific promise about the reunion of the divided kingdoms. Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 21 to 22, record God's plan. This is what the sovereign Lord says: "I will take the Israelites out of the nations where they have gone. I will gather them from all around and bring them back into their own land. I will make them one nation in the land, on the mountains of Israel. There will be one king over all of them, and they will never again be two nations or be divided into two kingdoms. One nation, one king." The division that had torn God's people apart for centuries would finally be healed. The northern tribes that had been scattered by the Assyrians and the southern tribes that had been exiled by the Babylonians would be brought back together. But this reunited kingdom wouldn't be ruled by just any king. Verse 24 identifies who this king would be. "My servant David will be king over them, and they will all have one shepherd. They will follow my laws and be careful to keep my decrees." This couldn't mean the literal David, who had been dead for centuries. This was a promise about someone from David's family line who would be like David, a king who loved God and ruled with justice and righteousness. Isaiah had given an even more detailed prophecy about this future king. Isaiah chapter 9 verse 6 describes him. "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." This king wouldn't just reunite the political kingdoms. He would bring peace between God and humanity. He would have divine power, but also human understanding. He would establish a kingdom that would never end. Verse 7 promises the extent of his reign. "Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever." The story that had begun with such promise under David and Solomon, that had been broken by division and rebellion, would find its ultimate fulfillment in this greater king. The kingdoms of Israel and Judah would not only be reunited, they would become part of an eternal kingdom that would include all nations. The exile that seemed like the end of God's promises was actually preparing the way for their ultimate fulfillment. The division that had caused so much pain and destruction would be completely healed by the one who would bring all God's people together under his perfect rule. If this story of division and restoration has touched your heart, I'd love for you to be part of our growing community here on the channel. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our biblical stories that bring ancient truths to life. Your subscription helps us continue creating content that explores God's amazing plan throughout history. And please, don't keep this story to yourself. Share this video with your family, friends, and church community. These timeless lessons about the consequences of pride and the hope of restoration are messages everyone needs to hear. Whether someone is going through their own season of division or seeking hope for restoration, this story speaks directly to the human heart. Drop a comment below and let me know. What part of this story impacted you the most? Was it Rehoboam's fateful decision? The tragic fall of both kingdoms? Or perhaps the beautiful promises of future restoration? I read every comment and love hearing how these biblical stories speak to your life. Remember, God's story of redemption is still being written today, and you're part of it. Thanks for joining me on this incredible journey through Scripture. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll explore another amazing chapter in God's unfolding plan for humanity. Until then, may you find hope in knowing that the God who promised to restore his divided people is the same God who offers restoration to each of us today.